Ma'am, stop pretending. That seat belongs to someone who actually paid for first class. The words sliced through the quiet cabin so sharply that every nearby conversation died in an instant. Heads turned. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting hands. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt louder as dozens of passengers looked toward seat 2A. Standing in the aisle was Naomi Brooks, a 45-year-old black woman wearing dark jeans, a fitted navy sweater, white sneakers, and a calm expression that refused to match the accusation hanging in the air. She didn't carry a designer handbag. She wasn't surrounded by assistants. There was no expensive jewelry announcing her success. She looked like someone returning home after a long business trip, which was exactly how she intended to look that morning. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Brooks. The man comfortably settled into seat 2A never looked concerned. Richard Coleman, 58, adjusted the sleeves of his tailored gray blazer and casually crossed one leg over the other. His polished shoes rested perfectly beneath the bulkhead as though the seat had always belonged to him. He glanced up with an amused smile that barely concealed his confidence. "I don't know what game she's playing," he said loudly enough for several nearby rows to hear. "But this woman is trying to steal my seat." A few passengers exchanged uncertain looks. One elderly couple quietly folded their newspapers. A college student removed one earbud. Across the aisle, a young mother gently pulled her little boy closer without saying a word. The lead flight attendant, Denise Harper, stepped forward with practiced authority and folded her hands neatly in front of her uniform. "Ma'am," she said with a polite smile that never reached her eyes, "I'd appreciate your cooperation. You're delaying our departure." Naomi didn't raise her voice. She simply held out her boarding pass. "Seat 2A, she replied evenly. "Would you please verify it?" Denise barely glanced at the document before returning it. "Sir is already seated," she answered. "Let's not create unnecessary confusion." Richard chuckled under his breath. "Exactly." A ripple of quiet laughter came from somewhere behind him. Naomi remained perfectly still. She had learned years ago that calm, unsettled people more than anger ever could. Airports had taught her patience. Boardrooms had taught her timing. And experience had taught her something even more valuable. The loudest person in the room was rarely the one holding the real power. She looked around the first-class cabin. Premium leather seats stretched toward the cockpit. Soft lighting reflected off polished overhead bins. Flight attendants moved with rehearsed efficiency, preparing for an on-time departure from Chicago to Seattle. Everything appeared polished. Everything appeared orderly. Yet beneath that polished surface, assumptions had already taken control. Denise sighed, lowering her voice just enough to sound sympathetic while ensuring nearby passengers could still hear every word. "Sometimes people accidentally board the wrong section. It happens more often than you'd think." Naomi met her eyes. "I boarded exactly where my ticket instructed me to." Richard leaned back comfortably. "Maybe check coach," he said with a dismissive shrug. "I'm sure there's an empty seat back there." Several passengers looked away, uncomfortable but silent. Others simply watched, curious to see how the scene would end. No one knew they were witnessing the first minute of a decision that would soon stop an entire airplane before its wheels ever left the ground. Naomi accepted the boarding pass without looking at it again because she already knew what it said. She had booked seat 2A 3 weeks earlier using her legal name, paid in full, and checked in online before sunrise. There was no confusion on her side. The only confusion existed in the assumptions spreading quietly through the front cabin. Denise shifted her weight and smiled again, this time with the kind of patience reserved for someone she had already decided was wrong. "If you will simply follow me, we can find another seat before we close." The aircraft door. Naomi calmly shook her head. "I am not asking for another seat. I am asking you to verify the one assigned to me." Richard released a short laugh that drew attention from passengers several rows back. "She is making this much noise over one chair," he said. "Some people just cannot admit when they made a mistake." The comment earned a few awkward smiles. Others stared down at their phones, pretending not to hear. Across the aisle, a businessman quietly removed his reading glasses and watched more carefully. A young woman wearing a university sweatshirt frowned as she looked between Naomi and Richard. Something about the exchange did not feel right to her, but she remained silent. Denise tapped her tablet for only a moment before locking the screen. The seating chart shows this matter has already been resolved. Naomi noticed she never turned the display toward her. She never offered to compare names. She never asked Richard for identification. Every decision seemed to begin and end with appearance. Naomi folded her hands around the handle of her carry-on suitcase. She had spent more than 2 decades walking into rooms where people believed confidence belonged only to someone who looked different. She remembered expensive hotels where staff questioned whether she was staying there. She remembered investment meetings where assistants handed coffee to her instead of asking whether she was leading the presentation. She had learned long ago that prejudice rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. Most of the time it arrived wearing perfect manners and professional smiles. Richard leaned farther into the aisle. If you miss this flight, maybe next time book economy where there is less confusion. Denise did not correct him. Instead, she turned back toward Naomi. Our departure window is closing. I need your cooperation. Naomi answered with the same steady tone she had used since boarding. Then let us solve this correctly. Please scan my boarding pass one more time. Denise hesitated for the first time. Before she could answer, another flight attendant approached from the galley carrying bottled water. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She slowed as she recognized the growing tension. Is everything all right? She asked quietly. Denise answered before Naomi could speak. Simple seating issue. We are handling it. Emily glanced at Naomi's boarding pass, still visible in her hand. For only a second, her expression changed. She looked as though she recognized something, but stopped herself from speaking. Denise noticed the hesitation immediately. Emily, continue preparing the cabin. Emily nodded, but as she walked away, she looked back once more at Naomi with visible uncertainty. Naomi caught the glance. She recognized it instantly. It was the look of someone who had just seen a detail that did not fit the story everyone else had already decided to believe. Around them, the aircraft door remained open. Baggage continued loading beneath the cabin floor, and passengers waited in growing silence. No one realized that every unnecessary minute of delay was quietly moving events toward a turning point that none of them could possibly imagine. The quiet inside the first-class cabin no longer felt comfortable. It felt heavy, as though every passenger was waiting for someone else to decide what was true. Denise pressed the button on the interphone mounted beside the forward galley. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that immediately changed the atmosphere. Captain Reynolds, could you please step into the cabin? We have a passenger refusing a seating instruction. Those words spread through the aircraft faster than any announcement. Several passengers who had ignored the disagreement now looked up at once. A man across the aisle quietly whispered, refusing instructions? Even though he had watched Naomi ask only one thing since boarding. Verification. Nothing more. Richard Coleman leaned farther back into seat 2A with a satisfied smile. I told you, he said loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. Some people always think the rules are different for them. Denise did not challenge the remark. Instead, she stood beside Richard as though the question had already been settled. Naomi remained exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her carry-on suitcase. She neither stepped backward nor attempted to move forward. Her composure contrasted so sharply with the growing tension that several passengers began watching her instead of the flight attendants. 30 seconds later, Captain Michael Reynolds emerged from the cockpit. He wore the calm expression of someone expecting a simple operational delay. What seems to be the issue? He asked. Denise answered immediately. This passenger insists that seat 2A belongs to her despite another customer already occupying it. We have offered to relocate her, but she refuses to cooperate. Captain Reynolds turned toward Naomi. Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass? Naomi handed it to him without hesitation. He glanced at the printed seat assignment, but before he could study it further, Richard spoke again. Captain, I have been sitting here since I boarded. I do not know what she is trying to accomplish, but we are delaying everyone. The captain looked from Richard back to Naomi. Did you board later than most passengers? Naomi answered quietly. No, I boarded with first class exactly when my group was called. Then why was the seat occupied? He asked. Naomi held his gaze. That is exactly what I have been asking. The answer lingered in the air. It was simple, logical, yet no one responded to it. Instead, Denise folded her arms. "Captain, we really need to depart on schedule." Behind them, Emily Carter stood near the galley pretending to organize bottled water, but her eyes never left the boarding pass still resting in the captain's hand. She remembered scanning Naomi moments earlier at the boarding bridge. She remembered the scanner flashing green beside the words First Class, Seat 2A. The memory would not leave her. Across the cabin, another passenger quietly raised his phone, keeping it low against his chest. A woman beside him whispered, "Please do not record." He answered softly, "Something about this does not feel right." Richard noticed the movement and smirked. "Go ahead," he said confidently. "People should see what happens when someone tries to take a seat that is not theirs." Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly before speaking again. "Ma'am, unless we can resolve this immediately, I will have to ask airport operations for assistance." Naomi nodded once, neither surprised nor offended. "Please do whatever procedure requires," she replied. "I only ask that every procedure be applied equally to everyone on this aircraft." Her words settled over the cabin like a quiet challenge. For the first time since the confrontation began, more than one passenger stopped looking at Naomi as the problem. Instead, they began looking at the people who had never once asked Richard Coleman to prove that seat 2A belonged to him. Emily Carter stood frozen beside the forward galley, her fingers still wrapped around two unopened bottles of water. She replayed the boarding process in her mind with remarkable clarity. Naomi Brooks had smiled politely at the gate scanner, presented a perfectly valid boarding pass, and walked down the jet bridge without hesitation. The scanner had displayed a green confirmation beside one unmistakable assignment. First Class, Seat 2A. Emily had watched it herself. There had been no warning, no duplicate boarding alert, no seating conflict. The memory refused to disappear. Captain Reynolds noticed her lingering near the galley. "Emily," he said, "did you observe anything during boarding that might help us resolve this?" Every conversation inside the cabin seemed to stop at once. Emily glanced toward Denise before answering. The lead flight attendant met her eyes with an expression that silently encouraged her to stay out of the situation. Emily swallowed. She was only 6 months into the job. Challenging senior crew members was not something trainees usually survive professionally. Still, she looked back toward the captain. "Sir," she said carefully, "I remember scanning her boarding pass." Denise interrupted before Emily could continue. "Everyone is under pressure during boarding. It is easy to remember incorrectly." Emily shook her head gently. "I do not think I am remembering incorrectly." Richard Coleman laughed as though the conversation amused him. "She is new," he said. "No offense, but rookies make mistakes every day." Naomi remained silent. She never looked toward Emily, never tried to influence her, never even nodded in agreement. She simply allowed the young flight attendant to speak for herself. That quiet confidence unsettled more people than any argument could have. Captain Reynolds studied Emily for another moment. "What exactly do you remember?" Emily took a slow breath. "I remember the scanner confirming first class. I also remember seat 2A because I was checking several passengers assigned to the first row." Denise answered almost immediately. "Gate assignments occasionally change after boarding begins." Naomi finally spoke. "Then the updated passenger manifest should answer every question." No one responded immediately. The suggestion sounded so simple that its absence suddenly became impossible to ignore. A businessman seated across the aisle slowly lowered his newspaper. "She has a point," he said. "Why has nobody checked the final manifest?" Beside him, the young woman wearing the university sweatshirt nodded. "Everyone keeps asking her questions," she added quietly. "Has anyone asked him for his boarding pass?" Her eyes shifted toward Richard. For the first time since the disagreement began, Richard's confident smile faded ever so slightly. "I already boarded," he answered with a dismissive shrug. "Why should I have to prove anything?" The businessman replied calmly. "Because both of you cannot have seat 2A. Several passengers murmured in agreement. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted almost without anyone noticing. 10 minutes earlier, nearly every eye had rested on Naomi. Now more passengers were watching Richard, Denise, and the unanswered questions surrounding their decisions. Emily reached for the electronic passenger tablet resting inside the galley cabinet. Denise stepped forward immediately. "That will not be necessary," she said firmly. Emily paused. With respect, the captain asked for information. Captain Reynolds extended his hand. "Bring me the tablet." Denise hesitated for only a fraction of a second before handing it over. The hesitation itself spoke louder than any explanation she could have offered. Naomi noticed the subtle change ripple through the cabin. Assumptions were beginning to lose their grip. Facts were quietly demanding a chance to be heard. As Captain Reynolds unlocked the device and waited for the latest passenger manifest to load, no one realized that the next few seconds would reveal the first crack in a story that had been built entirely on appearances rather than evidence. Captain Reynolds watched the passenger manifest load one line at a time across the tablet screen. The cabin remained almost perfectly silent except for the distant sounds of baggage containers being secured beneath the aircraft. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on the small device in his hands. Denise stood beside him with her arms folded, waiting for the screen to confirm what she had believed from the beginning. Richard Coleman shifted comfortably in seat 2A, still projecting the confidence of someone convinced the outcome could only favor him. Naomi Brooks remained standing in the aisle with the same composed expression she had worn since boarding. She neither rushed the process nor filled the silence with unnecessary words. The captain studied the display for several seconds before his eyebrows narrowed ever so slightly. He refreshed the passenger list once more. Then he looked again. Denise noticed the change immediately. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Captain Reynolds answered carefully. The manifest lists seat 2A under Naomi Brooks. For the first time since the disagreement began, Richard stopped smiling. "That cannot be right," he said quickly. "There has to be some kind of computer mistake." Denise leaned closer toward the screen. "Maybe the system has not synchronized with the gate yet." The captain did not respond immediately. Instead, he opened another page showing boarding records. Naomi's name appeared again beside a completed boarding scan and the exact time she entered the aircraft. Richard's record appeared several minutes later. A quiet murmur spread through the first-class cabin. The businessman across the aisle slowly folded his newspaper. "Well," he said softly, "that answers one question." The young woman wearing the university sweatshirt looked toward Richard. "May we see your boarding pass now?" Richard hesitated for only a second before reaching into the inside pocket of his blazer. He unfolded the document and handed it to the captain. Captain Reynolds compared both boarding passes without speaking. His expression became more serious with every passing moment. "Sir," he finally said, "your assigned seat is 4C." Richard blinked. "Impossible." "For Charlie," the captain repeated. "That is the seat listed on both your boarding pass and today's passenger manifest." Richard quickly pointed toward Naomi. "Someone must have switched them." Naomi answered calmly. "No one switched anything." Denise looked visibly unsettled. Perhaps another passenger accidentally directed him here during boarding. The explanation sounded weak even before the words left her mouth. Emily quietly lowered her eyes. She remembered seeing Richard walk directly to the first row without asking anyone for directions. She also remembered Denise greeting him warmly before continuing with other boarding duties. The pieces no longer fit together. Richard cleared his throat and attempted another explanation. "I assumed this was my seat because no one stopped me." The businessman answered before anyone else could. "Someone did stop her." The cabin fell silent again. His observation hung in the air with uncomfortable precision. Naomi felt an old memory surface despite herself. 22 years earlier, she had arrived at a regional airport wearing a modest business suit for the first major investment meeting of her career. A gate agent had questioned whether she belonged in the priority boarding line, while several white executives dressed almost exactly the same walked through without being asked for identification. She had smiled politely then, just as she was smiling now. That memory had never fueled anger. It had fueled determination. Every obstacle had become another reason to build something no one could take away. Returning to the present, she looked directly at Captain Reynolds. "This was never about a seat," she said quietly. "It was about which passenger everyone assumed needed to prove they belonged here." Those words settled over the cabin like a mirror. No one argued. No one laughed. For the first time since boarding began, the silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to realization. Richard Coleman looked from the captain to the passenger manifest as though the screen itself had betrayed him. His confidence dissolved into restless silence, but Denise was not ready to surrender control of the situation. "Captain," she said carefully, "perhaps we should simply reseat everyone and continue boarding. We are already running behind schedule." Captain Reynolds did not answer immediately. He continued reading the manifest, then compared the boarding records once more. Every document in front of him pointed to the same conclusion. Naomi Brooks had boarded correctly. Richard Coleman had chosen the wrong seat. Yet what troubled him most was not the mistake. It was everything that had happened after it. Naomi had been asked repeatedly to justify her presence. Richard had never been questioned until other passengers insisted on equal treatment. Naomi watched the realization settle across the captain's face. She knew that expression well. It was the moment when someone recognized that the problem had grown far beyond its original cause. She slowly reached into the pocket of her navy sweater and removed her phone. There was no rush, no dramatic gesture. She unlocked the screen, selected a familiar contact, and waited for the call to connect. The cabin remained so quiet that several nearby passengers could hear the ringing tone. After only one ring, a composed female voice answered. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks." Naomi spoke with the same calm precision she had maintained since stepping onto the aircraft. "Olivia, I need you to activate Flight Protocol 7. There was no hesitation on the other end. "Understood. Confirming Flight 318, departing Chicago for Seattle?" "That is correct," Naomi replied. "Begin immediately." "Already in progress," Olivia answered. "Please remain where you are." The call ended after less than 20 seconds. Richard gave a dismissive laugh. "Calling your travel agent is not going to change anything." Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket without responding. She had no interest in convincing anyone. Facts had a way of arriving on their own schedule. Emily quietly watched Naomi with growing curiosity. Whatever that brief conversation had been, it did not sound like someone trying to complain about customer service. It sounded organized, deliberate, almost routine. Captain Reynolds handed Richard his boarding pass. "Sir, I will need you to relocate to seat 4 Charlie." Richard crossed his arms. "After the way this has been handled, I think I deserve to remain right here." Several passengers exchanged surprised looks. The businessman across the aisle shook his head. "Interesting," he murmured. "He finally knows the seat is not his, and now he wants an exception." Naomi did not join the conversation. She simply looked through the aircraft window toward the runway, where service vehicles moved across the bright morning pavement beneath a clear Midwestern sky. She had spent years building organizations that depended on discipline rather than emotion. Whenever procedures failed, they were corrected with procedures, not arguments. Less than 1 minute later, the chime from the cockpit sounded. Captain Reynolds glanced toward the instrument panel, then toward the overhead communication speaker, as another alert followed immediately behind it. Denise frowned. "That is unusual." Before anyone could ask another question, the cockpit communication system signaled again, this time with unmistakable urgency. Captain Reynolds excused himself and stepped quickly into the flight deck. The aircraft door closed behind him. Inside the first-class cabin, uncertainty returned, but it was different now. Moments earlier, everyone had wondered whether Naomi belonged in seat 2A. Now every passenger found themselves wondering what could possibly happen next that required the captain to leave a resolved seating dispute in order to answer an unexpected operational call before the aircraft had even pushed back from the gate. Captain Reynolds remained inside the flight deck far longer than anyone expected. Through the partially opened cockpit door, Denise could hear only fragments of the conversation. "Confirmed. Yes, she is still on board. Understood. Immediately." His voice had lost the relaxed tone he carried only moments earlier. When he stepped back into the first-class cabin, the color had drained from his face. He no longer looked at the seating dispute as a minor delay. He looked at it as though the entire flight had suddenly become part of something much larger. Denise noticed the change first. "Captain," she asked quietly, "what is happening?" He did not answer her. Instead, he looked directly at Naomi Brooks. "Ma'am," he said with unexpected respect, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Naomi gave a slight nod, but remained exactly where she was. "You may speak here," she replied calmly. "There is nothing I have said privately that cannot be said publicly." The captain took a slow breath before continuing. "Airline operations contacted the cockpit. They instructed me that this aircraft is not authorized to depart until further notice." The cabin fell silent. Richard Coleman frowned. "What does that have to do with her?" Captain Reynolds looked at him without expression. "Operations informed me that a corporate executive protocol has been activated regarding this flight." Denise blinked. Corporate executive protocol? She repeated. I have never heard of that. Naomi answered before the captain could. Most employees have not. Richard laughed nervously. So what? Someone important missed a connection. Naomi met his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. No, she said evenly. Someone important was already on board. Those words settled over the cabin like a heavy curtain. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The businessman across the aisle slowly leaned forward, sensing that the story everyone thought they understood was about to change completely. Captain Reynolds looked down briefly before speaking again. Operations instructed me to verify your identity personally. Naomi reached into her pocket and handed him a simple leather card holder. There was no dramatic flourish. No expensive presentation. Only a corporate identification card. The captain examined it for several long seconds before lifting his eyes again. His posture changed almost instantly. He straightened his shoulders and returned the identification with both hands. Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Denise stared at him in disbelief. Captain. He finally turned toward the rest of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask for your patience. We are temporarily delaying departure under direct instruction from corporate operations. Richard stood halfway from seat 2A. This is ridiculous. Who exactly is she? Naomi answered without raising her voice. My name is Naomi Brooks. She paused just long enough for every passenger to focus on her. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Aviation Holdings. Several passengers exchanged confused glances. The businessman's expression changed first. Brooks Aviation Holdings, he repeated quietly. That is the investment group that acquired a controlling ownership position in this airline last quarter. Naomi gave a small nod. That is correct. Richard's confident posture disappeared. Denise took an involuntary step backward. Emily covered her mouth with one hand as everything she had witnessed over the last 20 minutes suddenly made perfect sense. Naomi looked around the cabin, her voice remaining calm and measured despite every eye now fixed upon her. The problem was never that someone accidentally sat in my seat, she said. The problem was that no one asked him to prove he belonged there, while I was expected to prove I belonged from the moment I walked into this cabin. You did not question my ticket because of evidence. You questioned it because of assumptions. That distinction matters far more than seat 2A ever will. No one spoke for several long seconds after Naomi finished. The silence carried more weight than any apology could have. Outside the windows, the aircraft remained connected to the gate instead of beginning its pushback. Ground vehicles that had already started moving away slowly returned toward the airplane. The departure board inside the terminal updated to show a temporary operational hold. Captain Reynolds received another message through his headset. He listened carefully, answered with a quiet confirmation, and then turned toward the cabin once again. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, corporate operations has instructed this aircraft to remain at the gate while an internal review team boards the flight. A wave of surprise moved through the passengers. Richard Coleman looked toward the front door of the aircraft, as though hoping someone would tell him the announcement had been made in error. Denise lowered her eyes. Emily stood perfectly still beside the galley, realizing that the brief phone call Naomi had made only minutes earlier had already reached every level of the company. The cabin door opened, and 3 airline executives entered wearing Navy business jackets with corporate operations identification displayed on their badges. They were accompanied by the station director, who greeted Captain Reynolds with a brief handshake before walking directly toward Naomi. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, thank you for remaining on board. We sincerely appreciate your patience while we respond according to company policy. Naomi nodded politely. I asked only that the facts be reviewed. They have been, the station director replied. He then turned toward the rest of the cabin. We have confirmed the boarding records, passenger manifest, gate scan history, and crew communications. We will complete a formal review after today's events. Richard shifted uneasily in seat 2A. This whole thing started because of a simple mistake, he said. Surely everyone can move on. Naomi looked at him calmly. The seating mistake was simple, she answered. Everything that happened after that was a series of choices. No one challenged her. The station director addressed Richard next. Sir, your assigned seat remains for Charlie. We will assist you there if you wish to continue traveling today. Richard quietly gathered his briefcase without another word. As he walked toward the rear of the first-class cabin, several passengers watched him pass, not with satisfaction, but with thoughtful silence. The businessman across the aisle simply nodded once, acknowledging that the truth had finally caught up with the assumptions. The station director then faced Denise and Captain Reynolds. Company policy requires that both of you conclude your duties for this flight, while corporate standards completes its review. Denise's expression fell. Immediately, she asked softly. Immediately, he answered. Captain Reynolds accepted the decision with a slow nod. Understood. Emily looked stunned. One of the corporate representatives turned toward her. Miss Carter, thank you for accurately reporting what you observed during boarding. Integrity matters. Emily swallowed hard and quietly replied, I only described what I saw. Several passengers began clapping, not loudly or dramatically, but with genuine appreciation for honesty finally overcoming assumption. Naomi did not join the applause. She simply watched the scene unfold with the quiet composure that had defined every moment since she stepped onto the aircraft. She had never asked for special treatment. She had asked for equal treatment. There was a difference, and everyone on board now understood it. As the departing crew members stepped off the aircraft and the review team continued documenting the incident, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed completely. The polished first-class cabin looked exactly the same as it had 30 minutes earlier, yet somehow it felt entirely different. It no longer carried the quiet confidence of appearances. It carried the unmistakable weight of accountability. Nearly 40 minutes after the first accusation echoed through the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had become almost unrecognizable. The review team completed its documentation, replacement crew members boarded the aircraft, and routine announcements quietly resumed. Outside the windows, the pushback tug returned to its position as ground crews prepared the aircraft for departure once again. Inside the cabin, however, something far more important than a flight schedule had changed. Naomi Brooks finally placed her carry-on suitcase into the overhead compartment above seat 2A. For the first time that morning, she sat down in the seat that had belonged to her from the very beginning. There was no celebration in her expression, no satisfaction in watching others face the consequences of their decisions. She simply fastened her seat belt with the same quiet composure she had carried through every uncomfortable moment of the morning. Emily approached carefully, offering a fresh cup of coffee. Ms. Brooks, she said softly, I want to thank you for how you handled everything today. Naomi accepted the cup with a warm smile. Thank you for speaking when it mattered, she replied. Doing the right thing is rarely comfortable, especially when you are the newest person in the room. Emily nodded thoughtfully. I almost stayed silent. Naomi looked toward the cabin before answering. Courage is not the absence of hesitation. Courage is deciding that honesty matters more than comfort. Those words stayed with Emily long after she returned to the galley. A few rows away, the businessman who had questioned the fairness of the situation stood briefly before taking his seat. Ms. Brooks, he said, I owe you an apology. I did not speak up immediately because I assumed someone else would. Naomi shook her head gently. Today reminded all of us that fairness cannot depend on someone else finding their voice first. The young woman wearing the university sweatshirt smiled quietly from across the aisle. Several other passengers nodded in agreement. The mood inside the aircraft had shifted from embarrassment to reflection. People were no longer discussing a seating dispute. They were discussing how easily assumptions had replaced facts. Captain Reynolds, now preparing to leave the aircraft as part of the ongoing review, paused beside Naomi's seat. Ms. Brooks, he said sincerely, I regret that we failed to provide every passenger with the same standard of respect. Naomi met his eyes with calm understanding. Respect is most meaningful when it is offered before someone learns a title, she answered. If people receive dignity only after revealing power, then dignity is not really being offered at all. The captain quietly thanked her before stepping off the aircraft. Moments later, the replacement captain welcomed everyone aboard and announced a revised departure time. The engines eventually came to life, and the airplane slowly pushed back from the gate it had never expected to leave so late. As Chicago faded beyond the terminal windows, Naomi looked out across the runway without saying another word. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded special treatment. She had simply insisted that truth receive the same opportunity that assumptions had been given so freely. Sometimes leadership was not measured by the authority to stop an airplane. Sometimes it was measured by the discipline to remain calm, while everyone else rushed to conclusions. The seat had never been the real destination. The real destination was a higher standard of fairness, one quiet decision at a time. And as the aircraft finally lifted into the morning sky, every passenger carried away something far more valuable than an on-time departure. They carried the reminder that appearances can mislead, titles can remain hidden, but character always reveals itself when respect is either given freely or withheld without reason. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, grateful that justice had not arrived through anger, but through patience, integrity, and the simple belief that every person deserves to belong before they are asked to prove that they do.